The Jerry Pal podcast is brought to you by Archstone Foundation. Archstone Foundation, improving the health and well-being of older Californians and their caregivers.
And supported by listeners like you, many of whom have donated on the Jerry Pal fundraising site, which you can find at www.jerrypal.org, big blue button, or through reviews, stars on your favorite podcasting app. Big thank you. Welcome to the Jerry Pal podcast. This is Eric Widera.
This is Alex Smith.
And Alex, who do we have with us today?
Today, we are delighted to welcome Redwing Keyssar, who is a midwife to the dying. She's a palliative care nurse educator and a writer, and she's joining us from the great state of Hawaii. Welcome to the Jerry Pal podcast, Redwing.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here.
We also have Mike Rabow, who is Director of Palliative Care at the Cancer Center at UCSF. Welcome to the Jerry Pal podcast, Mike.
Thank you.
So this is kind of a part two, isn't it, Alex? So we did poetry and aging. What's this one, Alex?
This is poetry, palliative care themed poetry.
Okay. So kind of part two. So if you haven't listened to part one, feel free to. Well, you don't have to have listened to part one to get a sense of what's happening in part two. But before we talk about palliative care themed poetry, Redwing, I think you have a song request.
I do, and I'm going to sing it.
What song is it?
So this song is called One Step at a Time. And I wrote it at the graveside of my dearest friend when I was 35 and she was 30. She died in a motorcycle accident. Absolutely the story of how I got involved in palliative care in the first place. But on New Year's Eve after she died, I was at her gravesite singing, which is one of the things I do, one of the things we did together. And I said, if you're really out there in spirit, send me a song. And the next thing I knew, this came through. Take one step at a time, my friend. Take one breath at a time. Think one thought at a time, my friend, and love all the time. Your heart is the key, my friend. You gotta open your eyes to the sky. Plant your feet on the ground, my friend, and let your spirit fly. Taking one step at a time, my friend. Take one breath at a time. Think one thought at a time, my friend, and love all the time.
That was beautiful. Have you always been inclined towards music and poetry?
Always. Yes.
Like since a little kid?
Since a little kid.
What do you think attracted you to it?
So I grew up in a pretty intellectual family, but my brother and sister were 6 and 10 years older than me, and they were always feeding me literature and poetry. And when I was about 9 years old, they gave me a book of poems of Edna St. Vincent Millay. And in school, I was asked to write a book report. And instead of writing a book report, I wrote a poem that went, a poetess, I'm sure of this, was Edna St. Vincent Millay. Her poems abstract, but I react in quite a normal way. Beauty, death, and God, of course. Ne'er a cat or dog or horse did she ever speak of. As for her life, she was a wife, and naturally was in love. So that came out at age 9. What I didn't know about Edna St. Vincent Millay at the time was that she was a radical and a bohemian and lived in Greenwich Village and had love affairs with men and women and did all kinds of things outside of the box. So I was very happy at a later age to know that about my first poet.
Lovely.
That is a remarkable story and terrific memory. Mike, do you have a similar story? And can you recite a poem from when you were in elementary school, please?
So I was not a big poetry fan until later in life. I actually got very excited about literature in 9th grade. I had this amazing teacher, Mr. West, who used to say that all great works of literature were to answer the question, who am I? And I think that that's been true for me my whole life, really thinking about literature, thinking about poetry, and really just thinking about my own personal development. And then it really wasn't until I got into medicine, medical school and residency, that I discovered poetry per se. And a mentor comment, I think, to a number of us on this podcast, Steve McPhee, introduced me to poetry. And it was really then, it was when I was an internal medicine resident that I heard a Mary Oliver poem. And it really connected to where I was at. I was having a difficult breakup at the time. And Mary Oliver really meant everything to me at that point. Her poem, Wild Geese. So I don't have any poems from when I was a little kid. I could maybe dig out a birthday card that I sent to my mom or something, but I don't have that accessible to me right now. But it's really, for me, poetry has really been entirely connected to my work in medicine.
Yeah. I'd like to invite you to read a poem by way of kicking us off and moving us along here. Redwing, do you have a poem that you'd like to start off with?
We have so many possible poems to share with you today, but
Great.
I'm going to start with Mary Oliver, who I really see as the poet laureate of palliative care. Her poems have touched so many of us, and so much of her content is about the work that we do. This is one that a lot of people know, and it's always worth reading over and over again. In Blackwater Woods. Look, the trees are turning their own bodies into pillars of light, are giving off the rich fragrance of cinnamon and fulfillment. The long tapers of cattails are bursting and floating away over the blue shoulders of the ponds. And every pond, no matter what its name is nameless now. Every year, everything I have ever learned in my lifetime leads back to this. The fires and the black river of loss, whose other side is salvation, whose meaning none of us will ever know. To live in this world, you must be able to do three things. To love what is mortal, to hold it against your bones, knowing your own life depends on it. And when the time comes to let it go, to let it go.
I love that poem. It always gives me chills.
Yeah.
I've probably heard it, 15, 20, 30 times. Always gives me chills.
Yeah.
What does that poem do for you, Redwing, and how does that connect to palliative care?
Well, like you, Alex, it always gives me chills when I read that poem. And I've learned it by heart a couple of times. I feel like it's just one of those poems, those lines about you must be able to do three things. And isn't that what we always work with patients, with our colleagues, with ourselves?
Mm-hmm.
That knowing that we are mortal, knowing our life depends on this knowing, and that there's going to come a point where we have to let go.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the hard point for so many people. And it's the point where we are often working with people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's also a powerful poem to read at a memorial service. Particularly with the let it go line.
Yeah.
Mike, do you have a poem that we want to get? You have many poems to read. We'd love to fill this hour with poems. Mike, do you have a poem you'd like to share with our listeners?
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to read a poem called Therapy by John Wright, who's a physician. And this is a poem about that sort of gets into this issue of what is the clinician relationship to all that stuff that's going on around us. I don't think I've ever had a palliative care fellow who I've been working with or precepting who hasn't come in after visiting with a patient and said to me, God, I didn't do anything. And this poem addresses that concern. You attribute my recovery to nortriptyline, its effects on neurotransmitters on the amygdala. you barely nod towards your worth, insisting on blood levels on therapeutic doses, while I credit half our success to pear trees blossoming white beyond your left shoulder, to the wisteria, its pink flowers hanging lush and fragrant over the portico, to the warmth of your hand. I think that, in almost every clinical encounter, we struggle with what's ours and what's someone else's. How much are we there as people? How much does it matter? How are we connected to the tragedies, the victories, the sadnesses that we are swimming in every day? And I think that we forget that the clinical encounter is very often just two people in a room experiencing each other, and that's what is sort of the beginning of that sacred space of healthcare and healing.
Mm-hmm.
And Mike, do you ever use poems like that with trainees, especially when let's say they're coming to you with that type of question? I'm not sure what I actually did in the last hour.
So very often I use poems with trainees, with clinicians in general. I make poems a part of essentially every IDT meeting that we have in my palliative care group at the Cancer Center. And we've been doing that for every week for 17 years now. So I've read a lot of poems to a lot of people. And it's pretty rare that I go online and Google good poems to read, just because people identify me as someone who likes poems. And so I get sent poems all the time.
So like this poem that you read by a physician, where did you find it?
I have no idea. Someone sent it to me.
I think I might have sent it to you.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, Redwing sends me a lot of the poems.
Redwing, where do you find your poems?
Find them all over the place. I mean, I have quite a digital file of poetry. Yeah. Because I've read poems my whole life, I have lots of poetry books. And when someone says something that triggers an idea, it's like, oh, there's that poem in that book. There's also the fact that many years ago, 4 maybe or 5, I studied with John Fox's Institute for Poetic Medicine and actually did the training to become a poetic medicine teacher, or they call it therapist. But and in that training, I just learned and was introduced to tons and tons of poems, many of which, I use and share. And, Mike and I have used a lot of these poems, and, we've taught poetry sessions at HPM, at the California Coalition for Compassionate Care conferences, where we'll do a workshop and ask people not only to listen to poems, but to write something. And what comes through people is amazing.
Mm.
I have to say, collecting poems is a little bit like sort of snowball recruitment in research studies, where you come to some poet who you can actually understand what they're saying. And so then you just read more of their poems. And so you read more Mary Oliver, or you read Mark Nepo, or you read William Stafford, just because you like them, or for me, it's that I could understand what they're talking about. And so that's what I stick with.
Mm-hmm. Redwing, do you have another poem that you'd like to share with us?
Many. So I'm about to read you a poem of mine because partly I see the use of poetry, of poetic medicine, as medicine, as part of a healing modality for myself and for everyone who I work with. Through the Mary Center now, I teach 3 poetry sessions a week, one on grief and loss, one poems for the wounded healer, and one on resiliency. And I personally come into poetry from the angle of using it as a healing modality personally, because I've now had cancer twice, and writing poetry especially through chemotherapy and through the healing process, was a really powerful way for me to be in that process and express the feelings. And so after my last chemotherapy in 2018, I came here to my healing place of Hawaii and spent time alone. And this poem, Hawaiian Waters, flat, black lava, resting green sea turtles, gentle, translucent turquoise water and waves. This life on earth is the real deal. Magic abounds and only requires open eyes and ears and hearts to experience its mysteries and power. Why not live as long as possible? Why not live as long as possible?
That's great. Yeah.
You know, when you're diagnosed with cancer, the first thing you think about is when you're going to die.
Mm-hmm.
And as I work with people and have worked with people for so many years, especially cancer patients, and in the conversations in palliative care, it's about what matters most now. How do we live our lives fully?
Mm-hmm. Can I ask, Redwing, do you ever ask patients or people you care for to write poetry? Or is that a part of your... It sounds like that might be a part of the workshops that you run.
So that's what we do in these workshops. So I had planned to start doing in-person poetry sessions with cancer patients at the beginning of 2020. And I did my first one March, like the first week of March in 2020. And then, as we all know, the world shut down and changed. And so beginning literally April 1st, 2020, until now, I started with one poetry session a week. It quickly had a waiting list so that it went to 2 and then it went to 3. And I said there are different themes to different workshops, but in those sessions, it's 1 hour. And there are 2 poems that I typically read. And then we ask people just to respond from their hearts and what touches their heart and soul. It's not about analyzing, criticizing, figuring anything out. It's like, what touches you in this poem? What word? What makes you curious? And then I give them a prompt, or they pick their own prompt and they write for 5 minutes. And when they come back, they share the poems they've written. And this has become a community of people all over the world who come together every week. People from the UK, people from Germany, people from Australia have come, people from all over our country. And they've created a whole community of people who know each other just by listening to the words that they allow through and the vulnerability that they show to people who they don't even know. And that has become such a healing force for so many of them.
And you guys know, but this is a nice time to announce that Redwing and I, with first author Ian Kwok and others, put a paper together to really try to organize our thoughts about how poetry can be a healing modality. And we talk about sort of the structure of poetry being used in writing, so writing poems with people, reading poems as part of a community, that experience of reading out loud and talking about poems, and then the use of poems in medical and clinical healthcare education, where people have a chance, I think, through poetry to grow in their empathy, to really understand experiences of other people, and also to really understand themselves. And so that idea of reading poetry, of writing poetry, and of using poetry in education is this sort of 3-part way of structuring the idea about poetry as a healing modality.
Mm-hmm. Is that publication out?
It's coming out May 15th.
May 15th, yeah. And we'll and that's coming out in JP
SM, Journal of Pain and Symptom Management. Yeah.
And we will have a link to that in our in the show notes. Some quick reflections, Redwing, and before we move on to Mike for the next poem. One is that poem you wrote, it right. We're so often in palliative care talking with patients about goals other than living as long as possible.
Right.
And what your poem centers us on is the amazing magical world we live in that inspires us to naturally want to live as long as possible, to move us out of ourselves and our clinician, palliative care clinician hats of, quality of his life. All these things are more important, essentially, into the patient space, where there are so many factors that motivate them to want to live as long as possible. So I love the way in which it operates on that level. And Mike and I go actually way back. In medical school, I worked with Mike on the comprehensive care team long before there was Jennifer Temmel's randomized trial of outpatient palliative care for patients with cancer. There was Mike Rabow's, maybe the first randomized trial of outpatient palliative care, and included this thing called art experientials, where patients with serious illness came in, engage in art with this incredible art therapist. I mean, incredible. And I only saw a small window into what the whole comprehensive care team did. But to my mind, that was probably some key component. And I worry that in some of our current, randomized trials, we've lost that more artistic element, a creative element, generative element of working with patients, if you will, and move more into the, getting back to Mike's poem, nortriptyline space. So those are just some reflections. Feel free to comment on that, Mike, or move on to the next poem.
Well, I do think that one of the ways that poetry is right at the center of palliative care is around the issue of paradox. I think we all kind of pay attention to the idea that maybe poems point us towards deep meaning. Maybe poems create a safe space for people to experience themselves or other people. But I think poetry is particularly palliative care because poetry is able to hold that middle space, sort of a liminal space, which is exactly what palliative care is doing a lot of the time, right? We're hoping for the best and preparing for the worst. We're trying to remember that everything is both and, not either or. We're doing all, and that's what Jennifer Temmel proved to us as well. We're trying hard to live in the impossibility of life, which means everything, and death, which is the end of that life. We're really trying to explore, Mary Oliver, the idea of holding something like your life depended on it, but also being willing to let it go. And so I wanted to read a poem called Adrift by Mark Nepo, which is about, I think, the paradox that we live in. And this is Adrift. Everything is beautiful, and I am so sad. This is how the heart makes a duet of wonder and grief. The light spraying through the lace of the fern is as delicate as the fibers of memory forming their web around the knot in my throat. The breeze makes the birds move from branch to branch as this ache makes me look for those I've lost in the next room, in the next song, in the laugh of the next stranger. In the very center, under it all, what we have that no one can take away and what we've lost face each other. It is there that I'm adrift, feeling punctured by a holiness that exists inside everything. I am so sad and everything is beautiful. So it's both. And it's hard to live in impossibility. It's hard to live in paradox. I think poetry is really helpful for me to be able to hold both things and to really situate myself or to situate ourselves in a world that is both incredibly small. How many milligrams of morphine do you give? And incredibly, infinitely enormous. The value, the preciousness of love and loss and connection. That's why I think poetry is so helpful to me.
And we've talked about one of the things your poem brings up is I think the word in their poem is holiness or holy, and that there's a long tradition of religious themed poetry, and this connection between poetry and the spiritual. I wonder if that's something that it sort of comes through in poems that you read, Redwing, and that there's a connection between ourselves and the natural world. And that's what comes through to me in Mary Oliver's poems. And it evokes that spiritual sense. I remember Steve McPhee used to talk about the I-thou relationship with you and the patient in front of you, and also the I-thou relationship, talking about a higher power. In his case, he's very Catholic. But for some of us, it might be an I-thou relationship to connection with beauty, nature, the waves, the sea turtles, the lava. Redwing, invite you to expand on that and to read us another poem.
So I certainly experience listening to poetry, reading poetry, writing poetry as spiritual events, because when you just, and I witness it every week with all these people in the circle on a Zoom screen, where you're just allowing some connection to something outside of yourself, but inside of yourself at the same time, to manifest through words, which is a pretty amazing thing. And so often people say to me, "Oh my gosh, I was so surprised by what came through." They hear a prompt, and when you start writing in 5 minutes without figuring out what you're going to write, just allowing, there is that sense of, call it spiritual flow for lack of a better word, that comes through. And I think, certainly for so many people with serious illness, whether they consider themselves religious or spiritual, we as clinicians, when we're with them, sense that there is some spiritual transition, paradox, questioning going on for that person dealing with a serious illness, and working with grief and not knowing how to do that, whether it's anticipatory grief or grief of someone who just died. And actually, here's a great one that is about this spiritual place. It's a poem by Elizabeth Berg called "Talk Before Sleep." I like to think that she looked out the window one last time the night she died, and saw with a new understanding the placement of the stars. I like to think something incomprehensibly vast and complex moved into her soul at that moment, and that it, not pathology, was what took her breath away.
I think we all live in that spot. Rachel Remin, who wrote Kitchen Table Wisdom, another mentor of mine, always used to talk about how we're already standing on sacred ground. And then the question is whether or not you can kind of open your eyes to it, or whether or not you can grow new eyes to see it, whether or not you can appreciate what it is. And I've always talked about, for me, palliative care as, in response to that question that we all get, like, "Oh, it must be so sad. Why do you do that? How can you do that?" From my perspective, suffering exists in the world already, and whether or not I recognize it, whether or not I'm open to it, whether or not I see it, is irrelevant, because suffering exists. And so my only question is what my relationship will be to suffering. Do I ignore it, or do I try and be of some solace, some help? And I think that each of us has the opportunity to sort of figure out what we're doing, what is at the center for us, what matters for us, what is sacred for us, what is worth putting all these hours in, what is worth putting our own well-being at risk for, what is worth opening ourselves up to the deepest pains we can imagine. I have a poem I want to read called "Years of Experience with Bows and Arrows," which has really been helpful for me as I'm trying to learn from other people what's important, and at the same time recognizing that I need to think about and understand what's important ultimately just within myself.
Mm-hmm. Who wrote the poem?
This is Olav Hogg, and it's translated by Robert Bly. Years of experience with bows and arrows. What you are supposed to hit is the bullseye, that black spot, that precise spot. And the arrow is supposed to stand there quivering. But that's not where the arrow goes. You get close to it, closer and closer. No, not close enough. Then you have to go out and pick up all the arrows, walk back and try it again. That black spot is highly annoying until you finally grasp that where your arrow stands quivering is also the center of something. And I think that, in academic medicine, in medicine in general, and probably in life in general, I think we all kind of grew up thinking there's something we're supposed to be doing, that there's a right way and a wrong way to do things, and we get rewarded for, accomplishments and achievements and doing the right thing as healthcare providers. And at the same time, we are also stuck with the reality that we have our lives to live and our understanding of the universe to grow. And I think poetry in some ways is a big relief to me, because it sort of validates just the fact that we're all allowed to have the experience that we have and to make the meaning of it that we make.
Mm-hmm. And Mike, you said that in 9th grade, you started getting interested in literature. Was that when it started becoming, it feels like it's much more personal to you right now. When did that start?
So, in some ways, poetry has always been a very private thing for me.
Yeah.
And I've read poetry and I've written my own poems, but it's been a very long path for me to really take advantage of the power of community, which is where I think poetry can really shine. Mm-hmm. So I've been dealing with living with multiple sclerosis myself for 13 years. And it's been a very private experience, and one that I've not shared even with some very close friends and close people in my community. But I wrote a poem about having MS and submitted it to a contest. And I made a bargain with myself that if the poem got published, if the poem won the contest and got published, that I would kind of come out as having my own illness of having MS after, 30 years of working with other people with illness.
And how long ago was this where you made the promise to yourself?
So this was in the fall. And then the poem did actually win. And so I was really forced to do what I had finally gotten ready to do after 13 years, which was to share the things that are most meaningful to me, and in some ways the things that I have the hardest time facing myself with other people. And it's been an amazing experience to share that poem. And I wanted to read it here. And thank you guys for the opportunity to do that. It's part of my healing. It's part of my gratitude for what the world offers me. So this is called Sliding Down. Every parent knows the question, a suggestion really, asked and offered with nothing but love. No challenge to independence or skill or bravery. Do you want to slide down on your butt? Just the hard part. Just the steepest part with the eroded soil and the rotted wooden planks. Here was my beautiful wife asking me, a grown man, her man with whom she'll stick no matter what, even after the MS progresses further and I cannot even slide anymore. Bristling a little with the question, I wondered privately, how will I get down? And do I really deserve such a sweet woman, caring if I do? And it's been an amazing experience for me to deal with my own shame about disability, for me to deal with my own ableism, and for me to hold myself apart from my work community and to try and pass as someone who wasn't dealing with MS and wasn't dealing with disability. And the process of sharing that, of reading that poem in community, has been amazing. It's really personalized UCSF for me, and it brought my vulnerability, brought so many people into my lives who were willing to share their vulnerable parts. And I will tell you, we're all thinking all the time now, how do we deal with burnout and how do we find resiliency and build that into healthcare and into palliative care? And my experience has been since sharing that poem with my friends and colleagues at UCSF, really quite broadly. I don't go onto a Zoom call these days without seeing someone on Zoom at a work meeting who hasn't just recently sent me an email filled with love and support, vulnerability, and their own sharing. So it's personalized my world, my work world, and sort of brought me a little bit closer to integrating the whole. And, when you deal with loss and when you deal with paradox, actually being able to integrate it all into one life, into your life, is one of the biggest challenges. And poetry has been helpful for me for that.
So often, we think that it's a more powerful position to not be vulnerable, to not let people see inside of who we really are. And yet the reality is it changes all of the dynamics when we're vulnerable with each other.
Yeah, and it in some ways, it takes a lot more courage to express vulnerability than to pretend that we don't have any of it. And I just think back to medical training. Expressing vulnerability is often a sign of weakness. I think in medical training, even terms like weak sauce or things like that make it so that it seems like it's not strong or courageous if you actually do express things like your own illnesses or your struggles. And that probably certainly does not help.
I heard a saying from one of the man's best hospitals in Boston. The strong will be strong and the weak will be weak. Right? And it just like punches to the heart of the matter there. Mike and Redwing, thank you so much for being vulnerable with us and sharing these poems with us and these stories about your own illness and your own illness experience. Redwing, we have time for another poem before you sing a song. Do you have another poem that you could share with us?
I have so many. However, let's end with a short poem by Raymond Carver that I use a lot, called Late Fragments. And did you get what you wanted from this life? Even so, I did. And what did you want? To call myself beloved, to feel myself beloved on the earth.
Eric,
Sometimes.
I got to check in with you. Eric is a self-described poetry skeptic. How can
No
you
longer.
not be moved? Eric, what's going on for you internally? Be vulnerable here.
So maybe I'm often I'm not intellectual enough. And I think Mike's comment about, for a lot of poetry, I don't understand it. And it doesn't bring me joy. I got to say, though, I think I'm going to give an example of Mike's poem. So I had the opportunity to read Mike's poem, which I thought was fabulous, but it didn't hit me until actually Mike said it in this podcast and I saw him. And that very personal experience in coming out made me emotional. So I do feel the power of it. Gotta say though, like reading a Shakespeare poem, never gonna get it. It's probably like, I know there's some things I should be doing as a palliative care doctor. Everybody tells me I should do meditation. Even my new iPhone app tells me I should meditate like every day. I'm not sure I've bought into poetry yet, but I think I'm maybe there's a nidus of change.
I would say that you don't have to buy into poetry. Poetry exists, like truth exists, and suffering exists, and beauty exists, and you get to decide how you connect with those things.
Yeah.
Whether it be through sports or love or sex or wine or art or your kids or other people's kids or your pet or anything that moves you is poetry. If it comes in words, then that's what we usually think about as poetry. But people have often referred to all these other meaningful things as poetry. The way song can be poetry, the way a sunset can be poetry. So, yeah, Eric, I don't believe that anyone has to convince you of anything. I just wish you well in finding beauty and meaning in your life.
Yeah. And I think what really touched me too is your story of making things from a personal to the importance of community. And I feel like that was probably a part of really what hit me when you talked about your poem, and the importance of that as a palliative care community and as a healthcare provider community. Is I do see the power of something like poetry or art, or like Alex said, it's not just about the nortriptyline and the mu opioid receptors, that there's something else that makes the work we do special.
And unfortunately, so many of us grew up with poems that weren't understandable.
Yeah.
And it just sort of set a negative stage of what poetry was and who was a writer and who wasn't. So many people who come to our poetry sessions say, well, I'm not a writer, I'm not a poet, I've never written a poem. And then, within the next half hour, they've written for 5 minutes and they share what has come through them. And we call it a poem, no matter what it is, because it expresses something important that came to them, and that this other circle of community on a screen understand who this person is by what they've just expressed. And that sense of community and connection is a healing in itself.
Well, Redwing, do you want to give us a little bit more of the song you started off with?
I'm actually going to sing a different one.
Oh, okay.
So one of the things that happens to me often is I change words to old songs. So this one I was standing on my grandmother's grave in northern Vermont, and I had just made a snow angel on top of her grave. And I got up from the grave and started singing new words to an old Quaker song. 'Tis a gift to know the spirit, 'tis a gift to feel the heart, 'tis a gift to know that where we end we start. And when we understand that the truth and the light are inside us to guide us, we come round right. 'Tis a gift to know the spirit, 'tis a gift to feel the heart, 'tis a gift to know that where we end we start. And when we understand that the truth and the light are inside us to guide us, we come round right. Thank you.
That was lovely, Redwing. Thank you. And
Thank you.
Mike, a very big thank you also for joining us, sharing your poems, including your very personal poem. Redwing, also very big thank you for being on the Jerry Powell podcast.
Honored to be here. Thank you both so much.
And the podcast, I would say, is a poem as well.
I agree. For sure.
I also can't believe it took us like 5 years to have both of you on our podcast. More than 5. How many years?
That's because there was some protesting from one of the co-hosts.
There are a lot of things we can talk about, but this is probably our favorite.
This is great.
Well, again, thank you for being on the podcast. Thank you for all of our listeners for your support, and Archstone Foundation for your continued support of the podcast. We'd also like to acknowledge the generous support for our Jerry Powell listeners who've donated over $250 each to support the Jerry Powell podcast,
including Meg Walhagen, Thomas Quinn, Rochelle Bernacki, Louise Aronson, James Tulsky, Arden O'Donnell, Mike Steinman, Mary Ann Forcia, Ashok Krishnaswamy, Nancy Lundeberg, Gail Cooney, David Schiffeling, Cheryl Phillips, and Jessica Eng. Thank you very much.